Lucas Reed had always been fascinated by libraries, the comforting smell of old books, the silent rows of stories waiting to be discovered. It was his sanctuary. When he heard about the Ashbury Library, a 19th-century Gothic structure shrouded in local legends, Lucas couldn't resist. The tales of whispered voices in empty halls and books opening on their own felt like fodder for his next novel. Lucas arrived just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the library's towering spires. The building loomed over him, its stone facade weathered by time, ivy creeping up the walls like skeletal fingers. The iron gates groaned as they opened, revealing the arched wooden doors of the library. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of mildew and age. The main hall stretched into darkness, the only light coming from a single flickering chandelier overhead. Towering bookshelves reached the ceiling, their contents barely discernible in the dim light. At the far end of the room, a mahogany desk stood beneath a massive stained glass window depicting a weeping angel. Lucas set up his writing materials at the desk, the rhythmic tick of his portable typewriter echoing in the vast silence. He felt an electric thrill. This was the perfect atmosphere to write a chilling story. As he settled in, a strange sensation washed over him, like being watched. He glanced around but saw nothing. Shrugging it off, he reached for the nearest book to seek inspiration. The spine was unmarked, and the leather binding was cracked with age. When he opened it, a single sentence scrawled across the first page made his breath gasp. "The writer will spill ink and blood before dawn." Lucas chuckled nervously. "Well, that's a little on the nose," he muttered, flipping through the rest of the blank pages. He assumed it was an unfinished work or some practical joke left by a previous visitor, but the words gnawed at him as he returned to his typewriter. He wrote for an hour, crafting the beginning of a story about a haunted library. The words flowed effortlessly, yet his thoughts kept drifting back to the book. Unable to resist, he reached for another. This one had a faded title, Shadows of the Past. The first page read, "The writer will hear the whispers of the lost before the clock strikes 12. A chill ran down his spine. It felt like the room had grown colder, the shadows in the corners darker. He slammed the book shut and placed it back on the shelf. The hours ticked by, and Lucas tried to focus on his work. But the oppressive silence of the library was broken by faint noises, a rustling, like pages turning. He looked up, his heart pounding. The shelves loomed silently, their contents unmoving. Deciding he needed a break, Lucas wandered deeper into the library. The further he went, the more labyrinthine it became. Shelves formed narrow corridors, and the flickering light barely reached the ends. He noticed a strange detail. Every book he touched seemed to vibrate faintly, as though alive. At the end of one aisle, a small alcove housed a single glass case. Inside was an ornate book bound in black leather, the cover adorned with gold filigree in the shape of an hourglass. It sat atop a plaque that read, "To read is to know is to doom." His reflection in the glass stared back at him, pale and wide-eyed. A shudder passed through him, but he told himself it was just a clever display. When he returned to the desk, he found the first book he had opened sitting there, even though he was sure he had put it back. Its cover faced him, daring him to look again. Against his better judgment, he opened it. The words on the page had changed. The writer will be betrayed by his own creation. Lucas slammed the book shut, his hands trembling. The typewriter clicked softly. He hadn't touched it, yet a single word had appeared on the page he had been working on. Run. Heart pounding, Lucas spun around, expecting to see someone behind him, but the library was empty. He grabbed his things, ready to leave, when a loud thud echoed through the hall. It came from the direction of the glass case. Curiosity battled with fear, but ultimately Lucas decided to investigate. As he approached the case, he saw the black leather book had somehow opened itself. The pages fluttered violently, as if caught in a wind that he couldn't feel. Words scrawled across the pages at an impossible speed. "You cannot escape. You are part of the story now." Lucas stumbled backward, his breath hitching in his chest. The words faded from the book as the pages settled. leaving it open to a single sentence. Turn around. He froze, the hairs on his neck standing on end. Slowly, he turned, and for a moment he saw nothing. Then, from the corner of his eye, movement. A shadow slipped between the shelves, too fast to be human. The faint sound of footsteps followed, accompanied by a whisper that sent a chill down his spine. Lucas. The library had become a trap, its once comforting silence now oppressive. The shadows felt alive, watching, waiting. Lucas clutched his typewriter like a talisman, desperate to understand what was happening. The books seemed to mock him, their spines gleaming with titles he didn't recognize, titles that seemed to shift and blur when he tried to read them. Somewhere deep within the library, a clock began to chime. Midnight. The sound reverberated through the halls, each chime heavier than the last. And then, the whispers began again, louder this time, echoing all around him. Write your ending, Lucas. Write it before it's too late. He raced back to the desk, his typewriter waiting. His hands trembled as he sat down, unsure of what he was supposed to write. But as his fingers hovered over the keys, the words seemed to come unbidden. The writer's fate was sealed the moment he stepped inside. Ashbury Library does not let its stories go unwritten. The typewriter jammed as the keys locked in place, forming the last word. Doomed. Lucas screamed as the chandelier above flickered once more, and then everything plunged into darkness. Darkness swallowed Lucas whole, leaving him paralyzed at the desk. His breathing was shallow, his pulse hammering in his ears. He fumbled for his phone, desperate for light, but it was dead despite being fully charged earlier. A faint glow flickered in the distance, pale and cold, like moonlight leaking through a crack in the air. The whispers began again, weaving through the oppressive silence. This time, they were closer, more insistent. Write, Lucas. Write it all down. No, he whispered, his voice trembling. This isn't real. This can't be real. But it was real. The heavy scent of dust filled his nostrils, the chill of the air wrapped around him like a shroud. Shadows moved at the edge of his vision, slithering across the floor and walls, their forms indistinct but unmistakably wrong. The books on the shelves began to tremble, their spines rattling like teeth chattering in the cold. One by one, they fell, their pages exploding into the air like a flock of ravens. Lucas ducked, shielding his head as the storm of paper swirled around him. The fragments didn't settle. Instead, they hung suspended, forming jagged shapes that writhed and pulsed with malevolence. From the midst of the chaos, a single book floated toward him. It hovered inches from his face, its cover blank except for his name etched in red. Blood red. No, he said again, louder this time, his voice cracking. Leave me alone. The book snapped open, its pages flipping wildly. Lucas stumbled backward, knocking over the chair. The words on the pages glowed with an eerie light, rearranging themselves into sentences that burned into his mind. You cannot escape, Lucas. The story demands an ending. He turned and ran, abandoning his typewriter and everything else at the desk. The shelves loomed over him like walls in a maze, twisting and rearranging as he moved. He swore the library was shifting, reshaping itself to keep him trapped. Lucas rounded a corner and stopped abruptly. The stained glass window of the Weeping Angel loomed before him, though he was certain it had been at the front of the library. The angel's face seemed different now. Its tears had turned to streaks of crimson, and its empty eyes seemed to follow him. Beneath the window, the mahogany desk was no longer vacant. Someone, or something, sat there. The figure was hunched, draped in a tattered cloak that seemed to absorb the light. Long skeletal fingers scratched at the surface of the desk, and its head tilted slowly as if sensing Lucas's presence. When it turned toward him, Lucas felt the blood drain from his face. The thing had no face. Where its features should have been, there was only smooth, pale flesh, stretched taut like a blank canvas. Yet, somehow, it saw him. He felt its gaze like needles pressing into his skin. "Who? What are you?" Lucas stammered, his voice barely audible. The figure's head tilted further, its neck cracking grotesquely. Then it reached out, and the black leather book from the glass case appeared in its hand. It slid the book across the desk, its bony fingers tapping twice on the cover. Lucas didn't move. "Take it," the whispers urged. "Right." He shook his head, his body trembling. "I don't want this. I didn't ask for this." The figure stood, its form impossibly tall and thin, its cloak billowing as if caught in a phantom wind. It pointed a finger at Lucas, and the shadows around him surged forward like a tidal wave. They wrapped around his legs, pulling him toward the desk. No matter how hard he struggled, he couldn't break free. When he was forced to his knees before the desk, the figure placed the book in front of him. It opened on its own, revealing a single blank page. "Write," the whispers demanded. The shadows loosened their grip just enough for Lucas to grab the pen that appeared on the desk. His hands shook violently as he held it over the page. "I don't know what to write," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. But the words came anyway, flowing from him as if they had been waiting all along. The pen scratched furiously across the page, filling it with sentences he didn't understand. "The writer's blood binds the story. The ink of his soul completes the tale. To resist is to perish." The more he wrote, the more the library seemed to close in around him. The shelves groaned, their wood splintering as books burst into flames, their ashes rising like black snow. The whispers grew louder, overlapping until they became a deafening roar. Suddenly, Lucas's pen stopped. His hand froze mid-sentence, and the shadows recoiled as if in fear. A new presence filled the room, a heavy, oppressive force that made the air impossible to breathe. The figure at the desk recoiled, its faceless head turning toward the far end of the library. Lucas followed its gaze and saw the glass case from before, now cracked and empty. The ornate black book floated above it, its pages turning on their own. With a thunderous clap, the book slammed shut, and the entire library shuddered. The stained glass window shattered, raining shards of colored glass onto the floor. The figure let out a soundless scream, its body dissolving into tendrils of smoke that curled toward the ceiling. The shadows released Lucas completely, retreating to the edges of the room. For a moment, there was silence. Lucas crawled away from the desk, his body weak and trembling. He looked toward the black book, which now lay closed on the floor. Slowly, cautiously, he reached for it. The moment his fingers touched the cover, the library erupted into chaos. Shelves toppled, books flew through the air, and the floor cracked beneath him. Lucas clutched the book to his chest as the ground gave way, and he plunged into darkness. Lucas awoke in a cold sweat, lying on the stone floor of the library. The book was gone, and the library was eerily quiet. His typewriter sat undisturbed on the desk, as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. When he looked down at his hands, he saw faint words etched into his skin, glowing faintly in the dim light. They formed a sentence he didn't understand, but knew all too well. The story demands its ending. Lucas stumbled to his feet, his legs unsteady. He had to leave. Whatever was happening, he couldn't stay. But as he turned toward the library's entrance, he saw it. The ornate black book sat on the desk, waiting for him. It was open to a blank page, and his name was written at the top. Lucas's breath came in short, ragged gasps as he stared at the book. His name gleamed on the top of the blank page, written in what looked like fresh ink. The air around it shimmered faintly, as though the book itself were alive and pulsing with an unseen energy. "No," he whispered. "I'm not doing this. I won't." But even as he spoke, he felt the compulsion deep within him. It wasn't a suggestion or a temptation, it was a demand, relentless and inescapable. His fingers twitched, aching to pick up the pen that now lay beside the book, its black surface polished and smooth like obsidian. The library seemed to hold its breath, the oppressive silence pressing in on him like a weight. Somewhere in the distance, he heard the faint ticking of a clock, though he hadn't seen one since he arrived. The whispers returned, softer now, but more insidious. "Finish the story, Lucas. The library must have its ending." "No," Lucas screamed, his voice echoing through the cavernous space. He turned on his heel and ran, his footsteps pounding against the stone floor. The rows of bookshelves stretched endlessly before him, twisting and shifting like the walls of a labyrinth. He reached the grand entrance hall, his heart leaping at the sight of the double doors. But as he threw himself at them, they didn't budge. He pushed, pulled, even rammed his shoulder against the heavy wood, but it was as if they were fused to the walls. "Let me out!" he shouted, his voice breaking. "Please, let me out!" The only response was laughter, soft at first, then growing louder and more distorted. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, a cacophony of mocking voices that filled his ears and sent chills racing down his spine. He turned back toward the library, his legs trembling beneath him. The black book was there again, resting on the floor a few feet away. No matter how far he ran, it was always waiting for him. Tears blurred his vision as he collapsed to his knees. "What do you want from me?" he cried. The whispers grew louder, the words coalescing into a single command. "Write." The pen appeared in his hand, though he couldn't remember picking it up. His fingers moved on their own, clutching the pen tightly as he crawled toward the book. It opened before him, the pages flipping wildly until they settled on a new blank page. His hand hovered over the paper, trembling. He didn't know what to write. He didn't know how to escape. And then, the words began to flow, not from his mind, but from somewhere deeper, somewhere alien and unknowable. The pen scratched across the page as if possessed, forming sentences he couldn't comprehend yet felt compelled to complete. The writer's blood binds the library, the ink seals his fate. To finish the tale is to accept the truth. The room around him began to warp. The walls cracked, the shelves splintered, and the air filled with a deafening roar. Shadows erupted from the floor, twisting and writhing as they formed grotesque shapes, faces with empty eyes and gaping mouths, their screams silent but agonizing. Lucas tried to stop writing, but his hand refused to obey. Tears streamed down his face as the words continued to pour forth. "The library is eternal, its stories are eternal, all who enter become part of the tale." The pen dug deeper into the page, cutting through the paper and into the desk beneath. The ink turned red, dripping onto the floor like blood. Lucas's vision blurred, his head spinning as the whispers crescendoed into a deafening chant. "Finish it, finish it, finish it." With a final desperate surge of willpower, Lucas threw the pen across the room. It clattered to the floor, and the book snapped shut with a thunderous clap. The library fell silent. For a moment, Lucas thought he had won. He slumped against the desk, his chest heaving, his body drenched in sweat. The shadows receded, the air grew still, and the oppressive weight lifted. But then, the book began to glow. A searing white light erupted from its pages, filling the room and blinding Lucas. He shielded his eyes, but the light burned through his eyelids, piercing his mind with images, horrors beyond comprehension, fragments of stories that felt as real as his own memories. He saw faces he didn't recognize but somehow knew, places he had never been but could describe in perfect detail. The light faded, and Lucas found himself back at the mahogany desk. The library was pristine, as if nothing had happened. The books were neatly arranged on their shelves, the stained glass window of the angel intact. But something was different. Lucas looked down at the black book, which now sat open in front of him. The blank page was gone, replaced by a perfectly written manuscript. He read the first line, his heart sinking. "The Haunting at Ashbury Library" by Lucas Reed. The story was his. Every detail, every thought, every terror he had experienced was laid out on the pages in his own handwriting. He tried to stand, but his body wouldn't move. Panic set in as he realized he couldn't even blink. His hands were frozen on the desk, his fingers curled as if still holding the pen. He opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. In the reflection of the stained glass window, he saw himself. His face was pale, his eyes hollow. He looked like a statue, lifeless and unmoving. The whispers returned, softer now, almost gentle. "Welcome home, Lucas. You are part of the story now." The library came alive again, the books whispering to one another as if laughing. Somewhere in the distance, a clock began to chime. The double doors creaked open, and a figure stepped inside. It was a young woman, her eyes wide with curiosity as she looked around the grand hall. She carried a notebook and a pen, her footsteps echoing in the silence. As she approached the desk, she froze, her gaze locking on the black book. It opened on its own, revealing a single blank page. Lucas wanted to warn her, to scream at her to run, but he couldn't. Instead, he watched helplessly as the whispers began again. "Write your story. The library must have its ending."